Brad, we're here for part 2 of the Ranking Summit, and for part 2, I just got to take two beefs with you this time to start. First is Mike Evans, you have up at 30th overall. I got to say, he's entering free agency. He has been the gift that keeps on giving, up into 1,000 yards every year in the league, but entering his age 31 season as a free agent, with quarterback uncertainty, Baker Mayfield may find greener pastures elsewhere. Mike Evans may end up just going to wherever he can get the most money. He may not be. We have no idea really. And Father Time remains undefeated. So Mike Evans at 30th overall, and then we also right next to him another old receiver, Amari Cooper, though rumored to still be 22 years old. Amari Cooper entering his age 29, or maybe he's actually 30 this year, 29 or 30. He's getting up there, and I'm not sure if Joe Flacco will be back for the Browns, but Deshaun Watson's getting paid an awful lot of money, and he has looked awful. So sell me on both of these guys inside your top 31.
Yeah, both Evans and Cooper are wide receivers that I want to be building my teams around for 2024. Beyond that, for Dynasty, not as confident. But we look at what Mike Evans, we thought he was dust this going into 2023. I was very low on Mike Evans entering the season, thinking that, wow, this is quarterback uncertainty. We've got Todd Bowles, who's not known to be a strong offensive coach. I thought the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were going to be one of the worst teams in the league. And what happens? Baker Mayfield starts playing a little reckless. Baker Mayfield is able to look down the field and utilize Mike Evans for his skill set. And that is making contested catches, getting open down the field. And Evans is able to score touchdowns, get big yardage, and that's what we saw the entirety of the season. Yes, there are concerns about, is Mike Evans going to move on? At this point, we don't know. You mentioned that Baker Mayfield may not be returning, but the fact that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were able to make the playoffs this year, win the division, there's been a lot of positive movement for Baker Mayfield. And therefore, if Baker stays, I think Mike Evans is willing to stay. Who else are the Bucs paying? Like, they've got a couple pieces on defense. They've got a couple pieces on their offensive line. But really, it's Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, who has a nice contract. But they're not paying a lot at running back. They're not paying a ton. I don't think Baker Mayfield's contract is going to be significant. So I think that the most likely outcome is Mike Evans stays, and Mike Evans this past year, wide receiver 7 in best ball value rating. So he absolutely put on a show. And while he may not be able to get back to top 7, maybe he does. And are we taking, for instance, a Mike Evans or a T. Higgins, who's clearly the number 2 fantasy scorer on his team, or who also has free agency questions? And if he leaves, then therefore quarterback questions that could be ambiguous. That's the type of tier and question that I have. I think I have more confidence with Mike Evans returning and with the history of production behind him. Amari Cooper, he's Mr. King Spike Week. And this ranking is influenced a little bit by the best ball streets. But also we know what kind of monster 100th percentile outcome Amari Cooper can have on a week-to-week basis. And you mentioned Joe Flacco may not be back for the Browns and probably not the quarterback for 2024 given the contract that Deshaun Watson has, but still I want some Amari Cooper when it comes to round 4. The upside is completely there. He's clearly the lead target earner. Our concerns are, well, if you're making the argument for Amari Cooper and your concerns, you're also concerned about David Njoku, right? One of the other target earners. And so you can't have it both ways. Like, those are the 2 leading target earners for the Cleveland Browns entering 2024. But if you're looking at wide receiver, I want one of those guys up there. And before I start picking my quarterbacks, I want to have a core of, as in particular, my structure of probably wide receiver heavy, and Amari Cooper should be up there given his previous production And we know that the other wide receivers aren't going to push him for targets. Like, it's not going to be Elijah Moore. Elijah Moore struggled to earn targets. He had one of the worst yard per route run and PFF receiving grades this year. He couldn't produce for fantasy. David Bell, no. Cedric Tillman, no. There are, who else? Like, Diamond Peoples-Jones isn't even on the team anymore. So it's going to be clearly Amari Cooper at the wide receiver spot, earning the target share. The previous production is huge. He finished as wide receiver 15 this past year in best ball value rating, and really wide receiver 14 because Mike Williams finished like just a hair above him, with Williams only playing a few games this year. So I like Amari Cooper in the first 3 rounds, knowing that you're going to get a lower floor for him, but you're going to get low floors for a lot of these wide receivers. I think that's the dirty little secret, Jake, is like when we're talking about how often wide receivers, quote unquote, hit, we look at percent chance that a wide receiver gets at least 12.5 fantasy points in half PPR, right? And this past year, Amari Cooper finished wide receiver 20 at 43% of the time. Wide receiver 20. His floor wasn't as scary as it's made out to be. A couple wide receivers who were worse than him: DK Metcalf, Garrett Wilson, Nico Collins, Zay Flowers, Jamar Chase, Devontae Adams. Those are players who had a lower percentage of games below 12.5 fantasy points. So we're talking.
Nico was in that list.
Yeah, Nico was in that list.
Wow.
Yep. And so the rate of the floor access is also something that I think is underrated for Amari Cooper when you're putting him in your lineup. Yes, he has got a scary floor because, as we mentioned, that's only 43% of the time that he's going to deliver. But that's the dirty little secret about wide receivers is top 14 wide receivers are going to be 50-50 coin flips at that. Yeah. I'm not as worried about floor with these types of picks, and I want to be targeting ceiling type of players, especially at the wide receiver spot if I'm selecting wide receivers in round 3.
Fair. So on the subject of Mike Evans, there's been some speculation going around surrounding Chris Godwin's wife's comments on Instagram. Have you seen anything about this?
This is a deep dig here, Jake. What is Chris Godwin's wife saying on Instagram about Mike Evans?
So sometime around the end of December, Coach Todd Bowles made comments at the end of the game. A reporter asked a question about Godwin's lack of involvement in terms of his statistical production.
Sure.
And Todd Bowles said that they were subbing him out because he was more banged up than usual. And then Chris Godwin's wife went on Instagram with his snap counts and posted that he was playing the same number of snaps that he'd always been, and Coach Bowles was just lying about his usage. And since that, Chris Godwin has gone from a 20% target share to a 29% target share. And during that same span, Mike Evans has fallen off in the last couple of weeks. So there's some speculation out there that maybe Todd Bowles is listening to Mariah Godwin. And
this is great. Yes, the squeaky wife gets the grease. Yes.
Indeed. I don't know. I think Chris Godwin, if Mike Evans does return to Tampa Bay with Baker Mayfield, that ebbs and flows, and Chris Godwin is a very good receiver in his own right, who's had a bit of a down year, like you said, with the deep ball being Baker Mayfield's one of his strengths, and Mike Evans being the more downfield oriented receiver. But Chris Godwin's going to earn his too. So that, to me, there's a bit of that DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. I usually tend to have them closer than the market does. Similar dynamic for me with Godwin and Evans.
With Evans as well, I mentioned the floor about Amari Cooper. Evans was wide receiver 5 in rate of weeks where he scored at least 12.5 fantasy points in half-point scoring. So wide receiver 5, compare that to Godwin, who is wide receiver 49. The concerns were that the lower ADOT in this Bucs offense was not going to get as many touchdowns. It wasn't going to get as many yards And while the target shares may be very similar, they're very different play styles, which lead to different fantasy point scoring.
Yeah, and the unfortunate reality for Chris Godwin this year, per PFF, he had 6.2 expected touchdowns based on his usage and where he was targeted on the field, and only came away with 2 actual touchdowns so far this year. It's just a bit of a unlucky season, I think, for Godwin.
And I have Godwin at 99th overall in my rankings, my way too early rankings. Jake, you have him at 71, so still a couple rounds different. We're going to find out once ADP comes out what adjustments maybe we need to make, or maybe we need to get into more drafts to reset the ADPs. But I think that there is concern that if Baker Mayfield does return, that we will see the same thing happen yet again, that it's going to be Evans who has the big plays and Godwin who operates closer to the line of scrimmage than Evans in a lot of those routes.
For sure. Can we also talk, Brad, while we're on the subject of older wide receivers, about Cooper Kupp? You have Kupp ranked 28th overall. I have him 38th overall. 10-spot difference there. Now we're both very, very high on Puka Nacua.
Yes.
Do you see that as more of a Kupp's still going to produce to the standards close to what we've seen before? Because I'm seeing a little bit more regression from him, but maybe that was just the injuries this year.
I think it's injuries. I think there's age. I also think that Puka Nacua has earned his target share because he's hashtag good at football. But even for as bad of a year as Cooper Kupp had, he still gave you 38% of the time at least 12.5 fantasy points. Like, he didn't completely fall off. Like, he didn't become a zero. That was worse than Amari Cooper, but better than your Nico Collins, better than Zay Flowers or Calvin Ridley. The floor is still better than Calvin Ridley, right? But that's what you're going to get from Cooper Kupp. But we know what the ceiling can look like. And Nacua had been dealing with injuries all season as well. And if something just goes the wrong way, it's going to be Kupp, because there's no one else. It's Tyler Higbee, I would say, is the third in the pecking order of target share among non-running back receiving options on the Rams.
No Tutu Atwell or Demarcus Robinson love?
Oh my gosh. We're not even going to go down that road.
Hey, Demarcus Robinson was a league winner off waivers. If you had a league with open waivers week 16, 17.
That is wild. That Demarcus Robinson finishing with a best ball value rating of 1.87. Let me get that ordered up here. But 1.87 was wide receiver 59. I mean, sure, back end
for
wide
an
receiver
ADP
5.
of undrafted.
Sure, you get a little bit of sprinkling there just in case. But I think Cooper Kupp is a round 3 pick for me this year. We know what the ceiling is. We know what the production can be. I do have him ahead of Evans and Cooper, but in a very similar tier. Old wide receivers who have a history of producing and who have produced recently, but I have concerns that everyone shares. Like, we were going to rank Nacua ahead of Cooper Kupp, and there's also the lingering injury, like long-term injury. There were rumblings this offseason, or during the middle of the season, about, is Kupp going to retire at the end of 2023? Is there a nerve damage issue for Kupp in his leg or his hip or wherever that he was dealing with? And so I think that is baked into my ranking of maybe there's one more injury that's going to set Kupp off long term. And that's why it's baked into mid round 3 ahead of, he's the wide receiver 2 on his team, but I'd rather have him than Jalen Waddle as the wide receiver 2 on the Miami Dolphins, or T. Higgins as the wide receiver 2 on Cincinnati, who I assume is going to re-sign, but maybe doesn't. Also ahead of Tank Dell, who is the wide receiver 2 on Houston. All in that like round 3-ish tier of wide receivers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's So I'm a bit lower on Cup, both because I think Nakua takes over as the full time alpha. This is also the first time in a long time that the Rams have had a first round pick, I believe. So they could make a
He's going to
splash
trade
with
it
a
away.
weapon.
He's going to Les Snead is just going to trade that thing away. F them picks. That's the I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure he had
yeah,
a
no.
mug. His daughter got him a mug that says F them picks. So
Oh
I would
my,
not anticipate
yeah.
them keeping it.
Do it for the brand. But hey, maybe they end up doing like a sign and trade deal for a Marquise Brown or a T Higgins, maybe a Michael Pittman, even one of these guys who is young and unsigned as of right now. Maybe they find their way to the Rams and they have another Woods Cooks Cup type trio like they did back in 2018. But I don't know. I'm just a little bit lower on Cup. I think the age and the injury, I think he might slow down a little bit, and Nakua taking over as the true alpha there is how I'm seeing them.
He's already taken over. That's the dirty little
Yeah.
secret, Jake, is that
Yeah.
Puka Nakua is the truth. And we haven't seen a rookie year like this ever, setting the rookie record for receiving yards and receptions. He put up a masterful season. Puka Nakua finishing as wide receiver 9 in best ball value rating. Obviously a league winner because you probably got him off waivers or you drafted him in the final round of your fantasy drafts this year. And even he did have a couple bust games near the end, that derailed it a little bit. Still wide receiver 7 in terms of rate of weeks that he scored at least 12.5 points in half point scoring. Still putting up wide receiver 1. For those who missed part 1 of the ranking summit for the way too early top 100, Jake and I talked about round 1, and Puka Nakua is firmly in that round 1 conversation.
Yep. Yeah, solidly in there. 9th overall for me, 11th overall for you. Yeah, we're big on Nakua. So moving on through the rankings here in round 3, Chris Olave, we are on the same exact page at 33rd overall.
Ooh, that feels good when someone else also see, because Jake and I we'll unveil for a second, right? Jake and I did these independently. We did not look at each other's rankings before entering the ranking summit, completely unadulterated. And it feels good when you have someone ranked at the same spot as a fellow analyst. So yeah, it feels good ranking him the same as Jake here.
Yep. And then we get into sort of the tier of wide receiver 2s on their team with Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins, Devontae Smith. Now, that's one where we have a bit of a gap. You like Devontae Smith a bit more than me at 36th overall for you, and I have him down at 48th overall. My primary concern here is that Jalen Hurts has taken a bit of a step back as a passer this year, and we've seen maybe there was some optimism last year that Devontae Smith could take that next step entering year 3 alongside A.J. Brown and maybe even be the wide receiver 1 there. But unfortunately, A.J. Brown is just him.
He is him.
A.J. Brown is really just dominating the targets there, dominating a lot of the high value red zone looks. And for me, Devontae Smith, wide receiver 32 in expected points per game. He's very much the Lockett to the Metcalf. He's the Godwin to the Evans. He's the potentially undervalued, but not as sexy option there. So for me, Devontae Smith, I'd be more comfortable taking him around that 4-5 turn range.
Yeah, and I hear it about Devonta Smith. We've also seen 2 years in a row where Dallas Goedert has been out long-term for injury, like 3, 4, 5 game stints where he's been out. And we know Devonta Smith earns at least 8 targets or more in each of those games. And so that's baked into where we're drafting him. But we also know he can just come out of nowhere and have these massive games. His ceiling is pretty close to A.J. Brown's, which is a wild thing to think about. But we look at week 2 against Minnesota, 4 for 131 and a touchdown. Another 7 for 99 and a touchdown against Washington, right? Taking advantage of bad defenses. Kansas City was 6 for 99. These are now weeks where even if we date back to 2022, 2021, he's going to earn a good target share. And I agree with you. Jalen Hurts was a little disappointing, which is why like it ties in though to my ranking of Hurts. I agree with you there. I have Hurts at 44. You have him at 27. I am concerned that Hurts has taken a step back a little bit in terms of being able to be an efficient passer down the field, but that may also be tied into the concerns of AJ Brown over the last few weeks. Just what is AJ Brown been dealing with? Is more injuries secretly? You talk about like, is Chris Godwin secretly injured? Darius Slayton just came on and said he had been playing with a broken hand the entire season.
Kyle Pitts
with we knew about the MCL stuff.
The PCL was news. I don't know if you saw that. He came out and said that he was dealing with the PCL surgery, which I guess, according to the Twitter docs, explains all of everything.
That would
take
probably
that with a grain of salt, I think.
I think now that Arthur Smith is out, I think we can be back in, chips in on Kyle Pitts and chips in on Bijan Robinson. There's a lot of pieces that still need to fall into place for that to come to fruition. Talking about Jalen Hurts, like the 27th overall feels like where he was going and supposed to go last year in round 3. And I was getting him, I think the latest I got him was the end of round 3 in some of the FFPC drafts I was doing. But at 44, I think it's just a flat tier of quarterback. And so you've got Hurts, you've got, at least for me, I've got Hurts, Jackson, and Anthony Richardson all at the end of round 4. And the reason why I think I want Devonta Smith at 36 kind of ties into where Hurts is going to go and just makes that stack a possibility. If we move Devonta Smith down even further, Devonta Smith or the risk of, I don't know, it looks like Jordan Addison. Between Jordan Addison and like Marvin Harrison.
I'd take Devontae Smith. I'd take Marvin Harrison over both.
Yeah, so I think that I'm very interested on where these landing spots are going to be for like the Marvin Harrisons or the Malik Neighbors of the world, who are projected to get pretty significant first-round draft capital based on the mocks I've been seeing.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll see where the rest of these wide receivers sift out. And maybe this is more of from a macro view, a conversation of where are these wide receiver 2s on teams going to end up and what is most valuable for their production. Is it their spike weeks? Is it their efficiency metrics? Is it their target shares? Like, what is going to be the driving force for getting you the most fantasy points? And Devonta Smith was wide receiver 23 in best ball value rating in terms of top 5 weeks. Like Devonta Smith had 0%, but 21% of the time he was a top 10 wide receiver this year. And we saw a similar split last year with Devonta Smith, where he was not able to necessarily access the top 5, but he was able to hammer pretty easily that top 10. And so looking over the last few years, I like Devonta Smith at the end of round 3, beginning of round 4.
Yeah. And now with Hurts, I got to ask, does it factor into your ranking at all the possibility of the tush push being banned?
No.
No, not a concern.
Okay. Because 2 years ago, he was not focusing on the tush push. Like that was not a big thing. And he was getting fantasy points. He was still getting goal line work. He was still getting the rushes. And if it's not going to be the tush push, it's going to be the end around. He's still going to get the ball. He's trusted around the goal line. I'm not worried about Jalen Hurts on that front. I am concerned about his inconsistency in connecting with the likes of AJ Brown and Devonta Smith and Dallas Goedert consistently, with Shane Steichen now out. And I think that it was an underrated storyline for this past offseason, is what is the long-term plan going to be? Because when we look at the season, most of the year you can start planning out like, all right, these are going to be our plays. These are going to be the structures that we have in place. But notice that when Philly started to spiral is when they number one, faced adversity, and two is that's where some teams just make the adjustments. And so I wonder about the ability for the coaching staff for Philly to make the adjustments necessary to win and overcome some of the adversity of whether it's injuries to Smith or injuries to Brown or injuries to Goddard or injuries to Jalen Hurts had a dislocated finger. Like, how are the coaches going to respond to adversity when a player, maybe Jalen Hurts is going to play, but he's not going to play at 100% of what he can bring to the field. There's play capabilities. My concern is that they got punched in the mouth and they weren't able to make the adjustments, which is why I do. My prediction is that Tampa Bay wins this game against Philly.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I could see it. Yeah. Not to stay on the Philadelphia theme too long, but moving a little bit further down the ranks here, we have DeAndre Swift, who you have 42nd overall. I have at 79th overall.
Ooh, why do you hate DeAndre Swift?
I hate fun. That's what it is, Brad.
You hate pass catching running backs on good offenses. That's what you hate.
I like my running backs as the get what's blocked and do what the coaches tell you to do types. That's the as if I know what the coaches are telling them to do anyways. But no, seriously, DeAndre Swift, I think the Eagles' plan all along, this is the genius of Howie Roseman at work. They traded for Swift while he's on an expiring contract, knowing that if they let him walk in free agency, then they can potentially get a compensatory pick that is of equal value to the fourth rounder that they traded for Swift in the first place. So I think that's the plan. I'm not sure that another staff is going to be willing to use Swift as leniently as the Eagles were, knowing that he was just a 1-year rental. And so I think that there might be a very thin market for Swift, and wherever he lands, he's potentially going to be in a committee. I'm not sure he'll get a very strong lead role like he had in Philadelphia again. Obviously, he's very talented as a receiver. Obviously, he's very explosive. But we've seen again with his success rate stats that he's really not the consistent kind of rusher that can stay out of the doghouse of a classic football guy coach.
Yeah, there is a question about whether DeAndre Swift has the dog in him, but the efficiency metrics, even with the work that he got this year, the 60% snap shares, the 50% snap shares, the 21st in true yards per carry, not too bad. 15th in evaded tackles, 17th in breakaway run rate, 11th in breakaway runs, 29th in yards created. Like, this was a player that finished at running back 26 in best ball value rating, and it could go one of two ways. It might fall all the way down to, I don't know if 79. I feel like his talent is just too good to get that far or that low, even if he goes on a loser team. But like, thinking about the teams that may need running back for this year, is he going to go to New York for the Giants if they let Saquon walk? Is he going to go to the Los Angeles Chargers? Is he, if they let Austin Eckler go? There's a lot of really nice landing spots in free agency. Could he go to Dallas if Dallas lets Tony Pollard walk? There's possibility of a wide range for us, for not just DeAndre Swift to replicate what he did this past year. Because at a 6.8 best ball value rating, like, it's fine. It was still behind your Brian Robinsons, but it was ahead of Tony Pollard, ahead of Aaron Jones, ahead of Ramondre Stevenson, ahead of Jalen Warren. And I think that my concern, maybe I am a little high given my bias on Swift and just the talent that I like for him, but he's never going to get the volume. But he has produced with limited volume in the past when even he was on Detroit. So there's a wide range where he could swing. I want to take shots on really athletic, running backs, and he's only 25. He's not 26, 27, 28. He's not past the age of apex yet. So he's still got some prime left in him. So I would take him obviously over a Raheem Mostert, David Montgomery type, but also over a Brian Robinson, who did have flashes this year. But Josh Jacobs maybe is more of a conversation of, is it Jacobs or DeAndre Swift? I think that's a similar tier for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, I was only half kidding that I like the boring, dependable, reliable runner types. But those, I think, are the stronger bets when we have this situational ambiguity. The workhorse build is a more likely, I think, to hit. So when you have a Josh Jacobs entering free agency, a Saquon Barkley entering free agency versus a DeAndre Swift or an Austin Eckler, then teams look at those guys a little bit differently. Not to say that I know exactly how an NFL GM is thinking, but just looking at historical trends as far as the roles that they try to pigeonhole these guys into.
Yeah, and we can talk about Josh Jacobs as well. Maybe I am a little too low on Josh Jacobs, if anything, because Jacobs has proven he can not only handle a significant amount of carries, but also he was able to catch balls out of the backfield this year. So I'm very interested in seeing where he lands, because it could be a boom for his fantasy value. We talked about DeAndre Swift being 25 years old, just turning 25 years old. Josh Jacobs is going to be 26 here in just a month or two. So a little bit older, but first round draft capital is not going to go away. And teams keep that in the back of their mind when they're looking at running backs. The first round draft capital running backs are going to stick around for a long time. And Jacobs has proven that he's able to handle heavy workloads, and that's something that's valuable in today's game still.
Yeah, absolutely. Though to be perfectly clear, you're still much higher than I am on Josh Jacobs. So maybe I'm just a little bit scared of these guys who are facing free agency with the current running back market that's out there. But yeah, if it was for me between Jacobs, Swift, and Robinson, the three guys you just talked about, I have Jacobs, then Swift, then Robinson. Agree with you on Swift over Robinson for sure.
I do want to just support you in the notion, though, that running backs tend to lose the most ADP from January to the start of the season. That of the ones, like when we track ADP over the course of the offseason, the players who lose the most tend to be the running backs, because we can even think of last offseason, Dalvin Cook was being drafted in these way too early drafts in round 4, round 5.
Yeah.
And then he ends up signing with it took him a long time, I think, for Minnesota to let him go.
Yeah, he didn't get cut until June 1st, like the day.
Yeah, it was frustrating because we wanted to see where he landed, and that didn't happen until much later. And then teams were like, well, we've already made our plans. We've already got our running back. And I think the Vikings had been trying to trade him for some time, but that's just an example of a player who lost a ton of ADP, and that's going to impact your how you're drafting in these way too early drafts. You got to think about, okay, not only what do these players bring to the table, but also what is within the range of outcomes, especially the zeros that you could be getting in your mid rounds, because you're already going to take some zeros. You're already going to get some L's, but what are the risk factors? Running backs tend to have those. And so maybe I do need to be a little bit lower on those older, crustier veterans. One player that's sticking out to me is Raheem Mostert, that I have right behind Josh Jacobs at the 4-5 turn. That's certainly a possibility and one that I'm monitoring, but it's just too tantalizing, Jake. I know we talked about Miami's backfield on part 1, but it's just so tantalizing, especially because we don't anticipate, there's no reason for Miami to move away from Mostert. They may
Right.
just find someone else, or maybe it's Achan who takes a larger step forward. Maybe it was just Jeff Wilson. Because remember, Jeff Wilson was injured, and that's why he was on the IR to start the season, which is why
Yeah,
Raheem Mostert got the majority of the carries at the start of the season. Maybe Mostert suffers an injury. Maybe he loses touches. That's possible. But those are things that definitely need to be in your mind if you are selecting players like Mostert or other older running backs.
for sure. And while we're on the subject of closing line value, or whatever you'd call the opposite of closing line value, anyways, it was some of the strongest bets for closing line.
Opening line value.
Sure, sure.
Since we are the ADP setters, right? We're going to be the ADP
Exactly.
setters.
So let's talk about some of the strongest bets for closing line value who are rookies, right?
Yes.
The rookie wide receiver class in particular, you seem to be very high on, except for one Marvin Harrison Jr. And when we talk about range of outcomes, there is a really wide range of outcomes here for the top of this draft class, because there are some wide receiver needy teams up in those very early picks where we expect Marvin Harrison Jr. to be drafted, right?
Yes.
We could see him if maybe Chicago doesn't find a trade partner who's willing to, maybe it's a Mexican standoff and they have to take Marvin Harrison first overall, or they trade back to 3 and take him 3rd overall. He could end up in Chicago. He could end up in New England. But there are 2 juicy dream landing spots here for Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors that I think would put their ADPs and their rankings through the roof with good reason. And that's Arizona and the Los Angeles Chargers. The Cardinals pick 4th, the Chargers pick 5th, and we could see Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors go 4 and 5. And I don't know, Brad. I don't know if I could rank them high enough.
I have Malik Neighbors ranked much higher than you do.
You
full
do.
round.
You do.
I am about a full round below you at Marvin Harrison. So just we'll unveil Marvin Harrison. I have at 47. So at the 4 or 5 turn, you have him at 37. So at the 3-4. Neighbors, I have at 51. You have at 63. Round 6, beginning of round 6 for Neighbors. And my concerns with those top, I like Arizona's landing spot. I think that would probably be the juiciest for Harrison. I think you could look at him getting into the DK Metcalf end of round 3. I think where you have him if he lands at that spot, because Kyler Murray can and most certainly would be able to sustain him as a fantasy friendly option in a dome, not going to be weather affected for most of the season. And they'll have the entire offseason to work together. I wouldn't be very concerned about that. But if he lands in New England, they're going to have to make some major shifts. Plus, there's weather concerns. Like overall, structurally, there's preservation in Arizona, whereas there's a lot of other structural organizational instability with New England, with Chicago, with other places where Chicago just got rid of their offensive coordinator, how many of the other coaches, and New England just parted ways with Bill Belichick. We expect Jared Mayo to be the head coach. That's not official yet, but there's contractual clauses that seem to suggest that Mayo is going to be the next coach there, but there's not a lot on the roster. There's going to have to be a major roster overhaul for the New England Patriots. So I think that I love the Marvin Harrison talent. I think he's in the 101 conversation for rookie dynasty drafts for sure. But for rookie year, I think Arizona is the dream, because you've got a head coach who's going to be there again, Jonathan Gannon, St. Ignatius High School alum. Go Wildcats. I went there, so I'm gonna always root for the St. Ignatius Wildcats. But Marvin Harrison, I think that's the dream, and that gets you into round 3 for that, because I don't expect Hollywood Brown to return this season. He's just for 2024. He's too disappointing. I think they want to give Michael Wilson an opportunity, and that's a player that I think we need to be drafting some more, because if
Really?
if Arizona does not draft one of those early wide receivers, then I think Michael Wilson has a leg up on any second or third round rookie picks that they may make. And I'm not confident in what Arizona could be looking at in terms of free agency. Like, typically Arizona likes to sign their free agents later, like later on. We for instance look at like James Conner as an example. It took a while for James Conner to sign in Arizona, but he's been mega producing there. I like Marvin Harrison as the landing spot. That's going to be really juicy. But Malik Neighbors, if he goes to the Chargers, for instance, we have Mike Williams and Keenan Allen who would be there immediately. I would still be drafting Neighbors very high in the dynasty drafts, but in year one, I think we would have to move Neighbors down to where you have him in the 60s and the 70s. That's still the JSN pathway, the Jackson Smith and Jigba. You're behind both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett for the season. Like you not just have to overcome one, you have to overcome two mega producers historically. And so I think that for Malik Neighbors, who would be competing with two historic mega producers in Keenan Allen, who was able to do it recently and for the majority of the season, and Mike Williams, who was the downfield threat, like, we know that they have the injury concerns, and Neighbors is going to have his weeks because both Allen and Williams have suffered a lot of injuries. Same thing with Josh Palmer. I think Malik Neighbors would have a clearer path to being the wide receiver 2 on that team and wide receiver 1 by the end of the season. But I think we would need to move him down because we're playing a season-long game. If we're doing just redraft 2024, there may be a lot lower weeks. You would probably have Neighbors move down into the Zay Flowers level, the Rashee Rice level, the Jaden Reed level. I know it's a little different for you and your rankings, but probably
I was
into
going
the
to say that
60s
would
and
be moving.
70s. It'd be moving them up.
That would be moving them up in my rankings. Yeah. Yeah. So let's get into that though. The year 2 breakouts that I seem to be much higher than you on are Rashee Rice and Jaden Reed. I have Rashee Rice at 29th overall, and you have him at 60th overall. I have Jaden Reed at 46th, and you have him at 62nd. So you have both guys at that 5-6 turn range, and I have Rice in the mid third, Reed in the late fourth. For me, Rashee Rice is a very controversial prospect.
That's very spicy. Round 3 Rashee Rice.
Absolutely. And so I'm conflicted, right? Because this low ADOT profile generally doesn't have a lot of historical background for success. However, when you have this low ADOT and you're getting the requisite volume, when you're in that 5+ targets per game range, like Rice is, and you're being extremely efficient on those routes, you're not just a pop gun slot guy, you're making things happen after the catch like Rice is. He's over 2 yards per route run. That specific profile, narrow though it is, brings up comparisons to guys like Wes Welker or Percy Harvin, are just the two names that I remember from when I was researching this off the top of my head. So I'm very in on Rice. Now, it's a very fragile ranking because if a T. Higgins ends up in KC or a Mike Evans ends up in KC, I think Rice automatically takes a back seat there. But with Kelsey aging out and Patrick Mahomes in need of somebody to throw the ball to and having some success, I don't know how successful you could call the Kansas City offense right now, running through Rashee Rice in the passing game, but he's basically all they have right now. And I expect him to develop a little bit more into year 2. And with Jaden Reed, I think that he's going to just expand his role heading into year 2 here. He's already finished as a top 24 wide receiver in points per game and half PPR. He's been used in the running game. He's been used in the short and the deep levels of the field. So they're using him in a very diverse array of route concepts that I think he's just really going to expand his role. As we may get into in later parts in the series, I'm not a big believer in Christian Watson. Romeo Dobbs is a fine player, but I
He's a
think
role
Reed is
player.
going
He's a
to
role player.
exactly. He's a far north Gabe Davis in a way. uh,
Woo.
but yeah, no. So I see Reed taking over as the number one option for Jordan Love next year. But you tell me why I'm wrong and I should be lower on these guys.
Yeah, Rashee Rice was a player. Let's talk positively about Rice because he stepped into a mediocre wide receiver room and was really good. His PFF receiving grade was the highest in the entire room the entire season. His yards after catch leads the NFL. So he's got the dynamism, he's got the speed, and he finished at wide receiver 36 in best ball value rating through week 17. I think that at 60, it bakes in the concerns that Kansas City has to address the receiver position. They're going to get rid of Marquez Valdes-Scantling. You can't afford to have Justin Watson be your wide receiver too and expect that you're going to be competitive yet again, right? Maybe they make a little bit of a run, but I think that they do address getting another wide receiver on this team. And Rice probably is still going to be the lead receiver on this team, but I'm also low on Patrick Mahomes because if they're bringing in someone, that means that Rice is going to be affected. Travis Kelce is going to be affected, but also it's going to take time for Mahomes to get into sync with that new player. Like it's going to take practice time. He's going to have to also change their usage because sometimes Kelce is the one used around the goal line and he's been really reliable. The Chiefs have been a little more run heavy as of late, leaning pretty heavily on Pacheco, which is why I'm in favor of Pacheco. I don't remember where I have him ranked exactly. I have him at 26. So I actually have Pacheco around ahead of you as an early third round pick because of these concerns that I have overall for the Kansas City Chiefs offense, that he's going to, from a pass catching perspective, that it's going to be, I think, another year of leaning pretty heavily on Pacheco. And Pacheco's been able to hold up for the majority of the season. So I think that's like my bird's eye view of how I'm handling the Kansas City Chiefs. And then I think the easy answer for Jaden Reed is that, yes, Christian Watson may have disappointed this year, but there were a lot of games where he wasn't even on the field. And that's why Jaden Reed was not only able to step up, but he was the centerpiece of the scheme. I think that both Jaden Reed and Christian Watson can coexist next year. I have both as top 62 picks for next year. And it's because of the recklessness that Jordan Love has been operating with, and I think will continue to operate with, because the philosophy is if it ain't broken, don't fix it. The Packers made a run to the playoffs because of Jordan Love, not because of Aaron Jones, not because of A.J. Dillon, not because of the defense necessarily. Like, the defense has stepped up from time to time, but it's been because of the offense and Jordan Love stepping up and making big plays down the field. Imagine instead of Wicks or Dobbs or Bo Melton, that it was Christian Watson. Like, you can have two Green Bay Packers who exist here. And I like Jaden Reed. I know I'm significantly lower than you on him, but at 62, like, Jaden Reed this past in 2023 was wide receiver 28 in best ball value rating. But that's inclusive of a lot of the games where Watson missed. So I think that both can still exist. Watson is, I think the difference between Watson and Reed is going to probably have a significantly higher floor when it comes to their play. Let me see. Reed this year, 44% of the time was scoring at least 12.5 fantasy points. Compare that to Christian Watson. Both of them like within about 7 spots of each other in best ball value rating. Reed, 44% of the time, got at least 12 fantasy points. Christian Watson was at 21%. He was half, less than half, and had almost the same best ball value rating. So they're just winning in different ways because Watson he's the speed athlete freak who wins down the field. So that's how I'm approaching the Green Bay Packers. I want both Watson and Reed this year, which is why I am very high on Jordan Love. You don't even have Jordan Love in your top 100. I have Jordan Love at 70 right now, ahead of Joe Burrow, because of the spike week potential that exists with Christian Watson and with Jaden Reed now, and with some of the other options that have stepped forward. So I may not like Jordan. He may give me heart attacks as a Packers fan. Go Pack Go. But the recklessness by which he plays, the upside swings are just so much of a possibility for Jordan Love, given the development of the wide receivers we've seen this year.
Yeah. So let's wrap up this part 2 by talking some quarterbacks here, because basically the entire 6th round here for your rankings is the quarterbacks. We have Dak, we have CJ Stroud, Justin Fields, Kyler Murray, Justin Herbert, Brock Purdy, Patrick Mahomes, Jordan Love, and Joe Burrow, wrapping up an entire string from 63 to 71.
Yeah.
And so talk to me. Let's start here, because we have some
like
comments
you and I. It looks like you are very similar to me for Stroud and Fields, and pretty close on Murray, and pretty close on Herbert as well, and pretty close on Burrow. It seems like you and I are seeing like that kind of tier is the right spot to be hitting quarterback as well. So I think for a lot of people that are drafting like in round 7 or round 6, that's going to be the time where, based on who you were drafting earlier in the draft, you're going to have to be stacking. Like, you're going to be looking for, I see them in very similar tiers. Certainly there's some differentiation between upside, but I think that it's clear that those types of players, based on who you are taking earlier in the rounds, that's where you want to be stacking your quarterback. That's why I have the ranking set up that way.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Especially because of the best ball context of your process. And I'm thinking maybe in particular, because we have a comment here in chat questioning the Love over Burrow take, how much of Joe Burrow's ranking for you is influenced by his production or lack thereof this year? Because for me, I'm taking this year for Joe Burrow and throwing it out the window. So I wonder if you used last year's best ball value rating for Joe Burrow, whether his, obviously last year and this year it gets a little messy trying to pick and choose what you want to use. But to me, I just feel like Joe Burrow is substantially more talented than Jordan Love.
Yeah, Joe Burrow last year was quarterback 7 in best ball value rating. He was behind Trevor Lawrence, behind Jared Goff, behind Mahomes, Allen, and Hurts. He was technically behind Wentz as well, but Wentz only played a couple games and got into the shootouts, of course, in those games. But behind him, in 2 years ago, this was 2022, was Fields and Jackson and Dak Prescott. And so when you get into that like tier, they're all just going to oscillate based on who the personnel is, based on injuries, based on those types of things. And so, having Joe Burrow in that very similar tier, boom, as I said, like, I'm fine with it. Just depends on who you drafted earlier. So if you're drafting Chase, or if Higgins resigns, then like you're going to be focusing on taking Burrow maybe at the top of the tier and moving him up, prioritizing him because of that. But that's how I'm approaching the quarterback position, and why, sure, Joe Burrow, Jordan Love, like you and I have Burrow at 71 and 67. So that's the right spot, I believe, for us. But Jordan Love, I think, definitely deserves to be in this tier, given the emergence of the wide receivers in Green Bay this year. Like, we just can't ignore that.
Yeah. And I can't help but feel like you might get some value then on Jordan Love when draft season rolls around, just based on historical ADP data. Having this many quarterbacks go within the first 6 rounds would be a bit unusual. But for stacking purposes and just as a thought exercise, I totally get the philosophy there. And then another one that I don't have in my top 100 is Brock Purdy that you
Yes.
have at 68 there. So are we expecting Brock Purdy to just keep it rolling with the touchdown rate that he's displayed with the 49ers and sustain this level of efficiency without any fall off, or
Yes, I think so,
or is it
because
just the stacking thing
the
still?
efficiency is clearly there, not because of his own efficiency necessarily. Like it's tough to parse that out, but he does his job. Like Brock Purdy does his job, and his job is get the ball to Debo, Ayuk, McCaffrey, and Kittle, and he does that job very well, accurately,
Yep.
and that's all you need from him. And so we're looking at, I think there was some data where another analyst went through and just compared Jimmy Garoppolo starting seasons of how many top 12 weeks Jimmy Garoppolo was able to get. And I think it was like 2 and 3 and 4 and 4 and
Yep.
4. And Brock Purdy last year was at 2 in his couple games that he played half the season. And then this year was at 10.
10. Yep.
10 top 12s. And Brock Purdy this year, quarterback 9 in terms of best ball value rating, ahead of Jordan Love, ahead of Patrick Mahomes, ahead of Goff, Lawrence, Burrow, Watson, ahead of Tua even. So like I want to stack, but also Purdy has been good, and we can't ignore that.
Yep. For sure.
All right. If you like the content and you found all this helpful, make sure you guys are subscribing to the channel. Make sure you guys are following Jake and I on the Twitter machine, the X machine, at 16 Fabian Jacob, at FF Stalder. This is the Ranking Summit podcast where we've been talking about, I think we can safely say we got through 6 rounds,
Just
part
about.
1 and part 2. So we will continue to have these conversations of the Ranking Summit from a way too early top 100. That will get us probably one more podcast, I think, is going to be able to get us through the top 100. Maybe we'll sprinkle in a few players outside of our top 100 that could be sneaking in there. But yeah, that's what we've been doing for over the last couple days. And I hope you guys like the content, found this helpful. Any last words, Jake?
Hey, it's always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to wrapping this one up. We got a real spicy one saved for the last part, so everyone tune in for that one. You won't want to miss it.
Spice is on the way. All right. Until next time, everyone, good luck in the fantasy football streets.